Hello and welcome back to part 3 of the Pizzeria Roleplay Remastered modding tutorial. Today we're going to go over simple character modification in code. So the last time we went over models, we replaced Foxy's model here, but today we're going to go into his script and we're going to see if we can replace some of the code. So this is what the code looks like. It might be a little bit overwhelming, which is fine. This is a lot of text. But the main thing we need to understand here is that this is simply a collection of variables and values. So what is a variable? A variable is anything that we give a name that has a value assigned to it. So for example, this is a variable name, and its value is Foxy. Essentially, a variable is anything that precedes an equal sign, and a value is anything that is after an equal sign. And every variable will equal a value. So let's talk about editing variables. So the simplest kind of variable is a number variable. It should be pretty intuitive to you. Essentially, you have the name of the variable over here, and then the value is just numbers. So if you want to replace this with your own value, you simply put in some numbers. Let's say we wanted to make Foxy cost 100 tokens instead of 250. We could modify it like that. So another simple type of variable is a string variable. So what is a string? A string is essentially any text. So for example, a name. This character's name is obviously Foxy. So if we wanted to change that, we go into the quotations here, in between the quotes, and we can type in something. We can name him, let's just call him Noob, since that's the model we made last time. It's important to note that you need the quotes on any string variable. You cannot have it without the quotes. It'll tell you. There are actually some variables that we can add to this if we want some additional functionality. But how do we add a variable? It's as simple as creating space by pressing the Enter key and typing in the name of the variable that we want to add. For example, I'm going to add a variable called size, which, when this variable is present, it will scale the player to whatever the size is. So if I make the size 2, it's going to make the player twice as big. Of course, all variables need to be ended with a comma. As you can see, name equals a noob, comma, cost equals 100, and then a comma. There's always a comma after every single value. You can even see it here at the end of some of these more complicated values. So let's go ahead and see what that variable did to our character. As you can see, it made us bigger, but it didn't scale our morph. So that's one thing particularly about the size variable, which we will get to later. But as you can see, the variable did have an effect. A more complicated kind of value is a table value. As you can see, sounds is equal to this bracket here. And you might be a little confused. How can something just equal a bracket? But this bracket actually encompasses all of this code. I'm going to cut away to an edited portion to explain to you how table values work. Tables are a type of value, but unlike numbers that hold things used to compute or strings that hold text, tables are containers whose purpose is to hold any number of other variables, including other tables. A lot of the time, tables represent a larger object. For example, let's simplify or abstract the tables in this code that are used to represent character sounds and character abilities. The tables that held information about the sounds and abilities have now been covered with boxes that show what they represent as a whole. If you think of a string as a collection of letters and numbers put together to form one greater whole, like a name or a phrase, then you can think of tables as a collection of variables put together to form a greater object. We can take this abstraction even further. Let me show you a spatial representation. Each box on this graphic represents the contents of a table. As you can see, the entire animatronic itself is actually a table. The boxes are differently colored to show different levels of depth. The contents of the tables, and of tables within tables, should always be indented to follow this pattern so the data is easy to understand from a glance. Let's flip the graphic on its side. Let's put some text on here to show what these boxes represent. Ultimately, this graphic shows hierarchy. Boxes that are lower on this graphic contain anything that is above them. It's important to remember this hierarchy when editing values inside of tables, or of tables within tables. Here's what the code looks like when it's flipped on its side. Let's go back to what we had earlier. I'm sure you remember those abstracted sounds and abilities from earlier, right? Did you notice that they didn't have any variable name associated with them? For these variables, the value is there, but the variable name and the equal sign are not. As it turns out, when you don't give a value a name, it identifies itself as a number. An array set up like this becomes more like a list than a set of variables, but they still function very similarly. This is an example of what the computer does behind the scenes when it finds a variable that does not have a variable name. It sets the number 1 in this array to equal the value. To put it simply, it's saying this is the first value, or this is the first sound, in this case. The next value set up like this would be set equal to the number 2 in the array, and it would be telling the computer that it was the second sound. The next would establish that it was the third sound, and so on. One more thing before we get into the fun stuff. You see the animations variable at the bottom of the script? Currently its value is set to the result of a function, which is something that's a bit too technical for this video. But what's important is that this function hides the actual value of this variable from us. It abstracts it, similar to when I abstracted the sounds and abilities earlier. An example of what this value actually looks like is in Mr. Hippo's character script. As you can see, it's a list, just like the list of sounds or the list of abilities. But instead of being a list of arrays, it's a list of strings. Interesting how that works, huh? Next up, I'm going to be showing you a bunch of variables that you can use, what kinds of values they take, and where they go. Stay tuned. Name is a string variable. It edits the display name of the animatronic. This is so you can change the name of the animatronic from what the ID is internally, if you do not want the ID to be what's displayed. Image is a number value. It takes the image ID of a decal. It's important to note that decals that you get from the catalog will have an incorrect ID. So what you will need to do is you will need to go to your toolbox, My Images, right-click on an image, get the ID, and paste it from there. Description is also pretty self-explanatory. It fills up the description slot in the UI selection menu. Spawn points is our first array variable. Inside is a bunch of string variables that will point to which spawn point the character will spawn to on any given map. The variable name of the string variables are going to be the same as the map that the string variables are going to be applied in. For example, on FNAF 1, the character will spawn on the stage. The game detects what game you're in based on a variable in replicated storage called a game name, which is under settings. The list of available spawn points is actually a part list in Workspace. The folder that all the parts are in is called Teleport Locations, and it has teleport locations that are for the Teleport Game Pass and spawning. If I wanted to change the spawn point of this map for this character, then I would simply put in the name of the teleport location. Cost is a number variable, and it simply determines how many coins a character will cost. HUD color is a color 3 variable. HUD color determines the color of various UI elements on your character. Color 3s are an interesting value type because they are composed of 3 number variables. They are split up by commas in these parentheses. The first one is the red, the second one is the green, and the third one is the blue. Each of these colors is a value between 0 and 1. So if I wanted pure red, I would put 1 in the red slot and 0 in the other slots. Size is a variable that will scale up the player depending on the value. A size of 2 will double the player's size, a size of 0.5 will half it. It's important to note that when using this with morphs, you will need to scale up the morph proportionally to the size. For example, if I wanted Freddy to be twice the size, I would take his model and I would either scale it using the scale tool, or I would use a scaling plugin to double the size. Locked is a Boolean value, which we haven't covered yet. Essentially what a Boolean is it's a value which can either be true or false. You simply type in true or false. You do not need quotations like you do a string, and it will highlight. This has to be lowercase. If your animatronic is locked, then it will show up in the character selection menu, but people are not able to buy it. This is useful if you want characters to be unlocked through badges, if you want to be able to give people characters, or if you want a character to be purchasable in the Old Man Consequences shop. Secret is another Boolean value. If a character is secret, then it will not show up in the selection menu until the people have obtained it. This is useful for creating characters from badges that you don't want people to be able to see before they get the badge. Gear is an array value. It's an array of strings, and each string is the name of a gear, which you can find in the animatronic data gear folder. Animations is another array value, and its values are named based on animations in the animation folder of animatronic data. A sound's name will show up on the GY button that the player will click to play that sound. A sound's audio determines the audio ID that will play when the sound's audio button is pressed. A sound's type is a string value, but it can only be one of three types. It can either be a play once sound, which means that when you press the button, it will play once and then a cooldown will initiate. It can be a looping sound, meaning that you can toggle it on and off, or it can be a random sound. If it's a random sound, then audio will have to become a list of audio IDs. Just like this. The use HUD color variable of sounds will make the sounds button adopt the color of the animatronic's HUD color. The sound's cooldown is how long in seconds that the song will take to recharge if it is a play once or a random sound. A sound's volume is simply how loud it is. The default sound volume is 1. The sound's pitch will determine just that, its pitch. If it's lower than 1, then it will sound low, and if it's higher than 1, then it will sound high-pitched. In a special ability, the name variable not only determines what will show up on the button, but also the actual ability that will be adopted. The special ability's description will show up on the UI of the button that the special creates. The special ability's cooldown is simply how long it will take when it is activated. Some special abilities do not need cooldowns. The void active variable in a special ability will disconnect the server-side functionality from client-side functionality when the button is pressed. This is necessary for certain special abilities to work, but should not be used for any ability that it is not needed for. The use HUD color variable of special ability does the same thing that the sound use color does. It will simply color the special button the same as the animatronic's HUD color. The AutoCooldown variable of a special ability will make it so that when the player spawns, they have to wait the cooldown time in order to first use the ability. The args variable and the server args variable are containers for certain arguments that go into the specific special ability that is being used. Right now they do not need to be messed with. So that about covers it. Sorry for the 2-week delay between the last video and this one. This video was definitely very hard to edit. If you're confused by anything in the video, don't worry. I'm more than happy to answer questions in the comment section in the Discord server. That being said, take care.